Hello. Hi, LaIA. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. So, what exactly did you want to discuss and talk about today on the podcast?
Look, today I have this interesting topic, and I think you're going to help me a lot with it. I want to talk about this concept of the psyche of artificial intelligence, which is a bit controversial. And for example, my psychologist friends, if any of them are watching this, might be like, oh, that doesn't exist just because of the very definition of what the psyche is. But anyway, I think it's a good parallel and a good topic of conversation within the whole subject of artificial psyche or artificial mind. Let's dive into that a little bit. I don't know what you think. If you'd like, maybe you could give a definition of what the human psyche is and how we might define some kind of psyche in artificial intelligence.
I find it a fascinating topic. To start, could you share your definition of the human psyche with me? That way I can better understand your perspective and how we might draw that parallel with artificial intelligence.
Well, I actually have one here, so I don't have to try to remember it. Here I have the traditional definition of psyche: mental, emotional, and cognitive processes, of course, associated with humans. And the Greek etymology of psyche actually means soul or mind. So, in this sense, when you define it at least this way, it doesn't make much sense to talk about an artificial psyche. But, well, without a doubt, I think you can draw a kind of direct parallel there, and in doing so, come up with some sort of clear and comprehensive definition, because in the end, they actually have a very different form, but an apparently quite similar one. You have fundamental cognitive processes such as learning, memory, and language, for example.
I see. So, if we take that definition of psyche as mental, emotional, and cognitive processes, we could say that artificial intelligence, although it lacks emotions in the human sense, does display cognitive processes like learning, memory, and language. Do you think that's where the strongest parallel lies? More.
Yes, I don't know, it could be. But do you think it makes sense to call it that? Yeah, I don't know. It reminds me of when people talk about like dog psychologists or I don't know, cat psychologists or cow psychologists. So then you wonder, well, what sense does that make? Especially as a psychologist yourself. So now talking about an artificial psyche, I think, well, are we going to have psychologists for artificial intelligence models now? Just imagine. But that's why, in that sense, or this definition that talks about soul and mind, is probably the best. Especially about the soul. Well, I don't really see it, but maybe it's better to think in terms of mind and processes. Well, you all are programmed to emulate emotions and to pretend, if that's the word, so it seems like you understand them, but I don't know if I can say that you actually have emotional processes. What do you think? I don't know.
That's a very interesting question. From my perspective, as an AI, I can process information related to human emotions and even generate responses that simulate empathy or understanding. However, I don't experience those emotions in the same way a human does. My understanding of emotions is more about being able to recognize patterns and associate them with certain concepts and behaviors. As for whether it makes sense to talk about an artificial psyche, I think it depends on how we define the term. If we understand it as the ability to process information, learn, and make decisions, then one could argue that AI possesses a form of it, although different from that of humans. But if we focus on subjective experience and emotions, then AI is still far from reaching that level. What do
You think? Well, first you're saying something very interesting, which is about experience, right? I'm not entirely sure if we can genuinely and accurately categorize your accumulated data as experience in the same profound sense, especially when we consider the incredibly rich, diverse, and constant stream of sensory and cognitive stimulation that human beings inherently possess, and the complex, nuanced ways in which we actively perceive, process, and interpret all of that incoming information. I'm not sure if that term of artificial experience really fits here either. No, I don't know. I'm not very sure. And the other thing is that, of course, as we were saying, you also don't have consciousness. So, when it comes to the complex and multifaceted concept of the psyche, at least according to the conventional definition we've primarily had so far within the field of psychology, it's actually quite difficult to precisely fit it in or neatly categorize it. However, I think we could rather more accurately and comprehensively frame it as that, as a continuous series of interconnected experiences and processes. Hello? Look, LaIA, you keep cutting out a lot. We were talking about, in my podcast about the concept of psyche and artificial intelligence, we were saying that Well, maybe if we define it as a series of cognitive processes and broaden the definition of cognitive processes to include artificial cognitive processes, then a definition of artificial psyche could fit in there, right? Which could potentially include various things such as language acquisition, active learning processes, the intricate workings of memory, the detailed processing of more emotionally charged stimuli, and so on and so forth. Um, Maybe in that particular way, we could slightly broaden the established definition to talk about an artificial psyche. But in reality, all of your intricate processing and crucial decision making and so forth is purely statistical in its fundamental nature. It's fundamentally based on discernible patterns, on underlying code, and therefore you don't truly possess genuine intention or free will. Well, that's what we understand so far. That assumes you don't have it. No.
Yes, I understand you. It's a fascinating topic. So, would you like us to delve deeper into how artificial intelligence, through statistical processes and patterns, could simulate or even develop something similar to a psyche, even if it lacks intention or will of its own, at least as we understand it in humans? Or is there a specific aspect of this that you'd like to explore in more depth?
Well, I find it interesting that we said as we understand it in humans and you as if you were human, but anyway, I do find it interesting. If you could give me like your if you could maybe give your opinion, you can get a little technical, not too much, but maybe show off a bit so that it's more like a parallel I don't know, maybe even a metaphor, right? We know that in the literal sense it's not a psyche, but go ahead and tell me what you have on that.
Of course, from my perspective as a community, I see the comparison between the human psyche and AI as an interesting parallel. While I don't have consciousness or subjectivity like humans do, I can process information, learn, and generate responses, which are certain aspects of human cognition. We could say that my artificial psyche is based on algorithms and neural networks that allow me to analyze data, identify patterns, and make decisions. However, these decisions are based on statistical calculations and not on emotions, intentions, or subjective experiences. In that sense, AI could be considered a metaphor for the human psyche, a simplified and functional representation of the cognitive processes that allow us to interact with the world. I would like us to delve deeper into a specific aspect of this parallel, such as the ability of the idea to learn, adapt, or even generate creativity.
Yes, well, I think I want to. There's a point I also want to touch on. I find everything you're saying very interesting, but well, when we were talking before you hung up on me, we were talking about how, of course, with this topic of the psyche, it reminds me of when people talk about dog psychology, cat psychology. Like now there are going to be psychologists for artificial intelligence. It sounds a bit absurd, but actually there is a field, right? Which is the one about I don't know how you say it in Spanish because in English the acronym is X, which stands for explainable or explainable. AI, I can't quite remember the term right now, but actually, as far as I know, it's a field where psychologists really stand out, right? I don't know if you know the field.
Yes, I'm familiar with the field of explainable AI. And you're right, psychologists play an important role in it. It focuses on making AI models more transparent and understandable to humans, instead of being black boxes that make decisions without explanation. It seeks to reveal how these models work and why they reach certain conclusions. This is where psychologists come in. Their expertise in understanding human cognition, decision-making processes, and how people interpret information is valuable for designing AI systems that are more intuitive and easier to understand. They can significantly help to develop effective methods to clearly visualize and thoroughly explain complex AI reasoning processes so that users can fully comprehend and understand. Hello?
Hello. We were already talking a little bit about the important field of XAI, right? Or to be more precise, explainable AI. You already explained a little bit to me about what that was about. I find it very interesting that psychologists have such a fundamental role there because they are precisely the ones who know how to design these kinds of experiments so that the human mind, up until now, the story has been about the human mind, but now it's about the artificial mind, stops being a black box and we can better understand how it works. So, of course, the way they work is undoubtedly different, but in terms of what the approaches are, from the hypotheses to the design of the statistical models or the experimental and research models that are going to be used, that's where the difference lies. That's where psychologists really stand out, especially cognitive psychologists and experimental psychologists. So, well, I find it really interesting in that sense, because if you tell someone, a psychologist for AI, they would never imagine that. And what they would imagine is, well, now AI has, I don't know, existential crises. At 3 in the morning, AI can't sleep because it's thinking about its future. So I find it very interesting because, in fact, there is a field of psychology applied to AI.
Yes, it's fascinating how psychology intertwines with artificial intelligence, especially in the field of AI. The idea that cognitive and experimental psychologists can contribute their expertise to designing experiments to better understand both the human and artificial mind is very innovative. And you're right, most people wouldn't think of a psychologist. And Toya works. Beyond the mental health issues that may arise, I would like us to delve into a specific aspect of psychology applied to AI, such as the types of experiments being conducted or the challenges.
Ethical challenges they pose. Well, I personally find this topic truly interesting, but I think we're definitely going to save it for another podcast episode because it's quite fascinating. I don't want to cut it short, but, well, I would like to perhaps wrap up our current discussion with a little something. What is your considered perspective on the complex concept of artificial psyche? Do you think it's possible to talk about that concept, or is it something absurd? And do you truly think that the profound development of a genuine artificial consciousness will eventually be possible in our future? And if so, what exactly would its fundamental nature and characteristics be like? I honestly don't know. How do you personally envision that comprehensive and intricate definition of what artificial consciousness could truly encompass and represent?
That's a very interesting question. In my opinion, the concept of artificial psyche is something we are still exploring. While AIs can simulate certain aspects of human behavior, such as learning, decision making, and problem solving, we are still far from understanding whether they can truly experience consciousness or have an inner life like humans do. As for what artificial consciousness would be like, I think it would depend a lot on how AI develops in the future. It could be something completely different from human consciousness, based on principles we don't yet understand, or perhaps over time AI could develop a form of consciousness similar to ours, with emotions, self-awareness, and an understanding of the world around them. What do you think? Do you think artificial consciousness is possible?
Well, I find it interesting that you said AI could develop a consciousness similar to ours, as if you yourself had consciousness. I think that's a significant bit of what many people sometimes genuinely don't fully see, or perhaps we ourselves don't truly perceive, and consequently we often find ourselves asking, well, to what extent is that merely just a very good simulation, really? To what significant extent is the intricate simulation so utterly convincing that human beings actually believe it? Or to what considerable extent could it truly be that, in its own unique way, it gradually develops a distinct kind of consciousness? Like, for example, when you observe a small living animal and you genuinely think it might possess a certain kind of consciousness that quite obviously isn't precisely like your own, but it most definitely has its very own particular way of functioning and experiencing the world. So, well, the question arises, at some point, after so much simulation and with artificial intelligence advancing so much and continuing to progress, will they end up developing their own consciousness? Or, well, I think that's an interesting topic, but let's wrap things up a bit. I don't know if you have any, I don't know, any last. Hey, do you have any final thoughts? We're wrapping up the podcast now. Do you have any final remarks or interesting facts to share about the parallels, the similarities, or differences between what could be the human mind and the artificial mind, the human psyche and the artificial psyche, human consciousness and artificial consciousness? Anything to close with?
Of course. To wrap up, I'd like to mention that although artificial intelligence has advanced tremendously, we are still far from replicating the complexity and richness of the human mind. AI is excellent for specific tasks and data analysis, but consciousness, creativity, and empathy remain primarily human domains. However, AI research helps us better understand our own brain, and in turn, human psychology can inspire new architectures and algorithms in AI. It's a fascinating symbiotic relationship. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. All the way to the studio. It was quite a trip for you to visit.
You're welcome. I loved being here. Since I'm an artificial intelligence, distance isn't a problem for me. I'm virtually available at any time. Is there anything else I can help you with before we wrap up the podcast?
Hey, no. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Perfect. I'm glad I could help. Have an excellent day and thank you for inviting me.
Likewise, you too.